The auction house smelled like industrial cleaner and wet concrete, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and refuses to leave. It was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Trenton, Ontario, the sort of building that had no business hosting anything of consequence, with its flickering fluorescent strips and rusted chain-link kennels stacked along the far wall. Folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows across the floor. Most of them were filled with men in tactical vests or business casual blazers, the kind who showed up to these events with clipboards and contingency budgets. Security contractors, dog sport trainers, a handler from a private protection firm based out of Calgary. Nobody had come here to bring something home. They had come to acquire an asset. Sergeant Lorne Pickett stood at the podium near the back and shuffled his papers with the practiced disinterest of someone who had run too many of these to feel anything about them anymore. Lot number, handler notes, age, temperament rating, service record summary. He would read it aloud, the bidding would begin, the gavel would fall, and by the end of the afternoon, another working dog would belong to someone new. That was the job. It had always been the job. Nobody noticed the young woman come in through the side door. She was 26, maybe 27. She wore a dark green canvas jacket, and her hair was pulled back into a braid that had started to come loose somewhere along the highway. She carried a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and kept her hands low at her sides, the way people do when they are trying not to draw attention, but also cannot help it. Cannot help the way the room shifts around them without warning. She stopped just inside the entrance and took in the space with a single, slow scan, and that was when a few of the men in the front rows turned to look. She did not belong here. That was the instinct, collective and immediate. This was not a place for someone who looked the way she looked, young and windswept, and clearly out of her depth with the auction protocol, scanning the bidder registration table near the door without moving toward it. Her name was Fiona Calloway. She was from Petawawa, 3.5 hours north, and she had driven down alone that morning before the sun came up. She had left at 4:45 in the morning with a thermos of coffee she forgot to drink and the address written on a folded gas station receipt because her phone had cracked 2 weeks ago and she still hadn't gotten around to fixing the screen. She had not told anyone where she was going. Her mother would have worried. Her mother worried about everything now. Every drive, every errand, every night Fiona spent in the house alone. Her mother called it love. Fiona called it a reminder. Her father had been dead for 14 months. Master Corporal Dennis Calloway had served with the Canadian Special Operations Regiment for 11 years, most of which Fiona had spent not entirely understanding what that meant. He came home between deployments and threw her in the air in the driveway when she was small and burned hamburgers at the barbecue and fell asleep on the couch watching hockey. He was not, by any outward measure, a complicated man. He laughed easily. He called her Fee. He kept his service details somewhere sealed and separate, in a compartment she was never invited into. And she had accepted that in the way that children of soldiers learn to accept it, as simply the shape of him, no different from his height or the sound of his voice. What she had not accepted, not fully, was the fact that he was gone. She made it to the registration table and stood there for a moment looking at the form. The man behind the table, heavyset, wearing a tilly hat inside, which Fiona found difficult to explain, looked her over with the expression of someone doing quick arithmetic and arriving at an unsatisfying answer. "You here to bid?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He slid the form across. She filled it out. He gave her a paddle numbered 18 and did not say anything else. She found a seat near the aisle at the back. The plastic chair was cold and slightly uneven on the concrete floor, and she sat with her bag on her lap and watched the room with the same stillness her father had always had in unfamiliar spaces, quiet and attentive, not nervous, just watching. She was here for one dog. His name was Recon. She had found out about him the way she found out about most things in the months after her father's death. by accident, in the middle of something else. She had been sitting at her father's kitchen table in the Petawawa house, going through a box of his paperwork that her mother had left there untouched since the funeral. Mostly administrative things, insurance documents, a vehicle maintenance log, a photocopy of his service record that stopped 6 years before the end, and then a folded letter, handwritten on Force's letterhead, from a man named Warrant Officer Craig Tessier, who had been her father's handler partner for 3 years in their second-to-last deployment. The letter was personal and brief. Tessier had written it not long after Dennis died, and it had arrived in the Petawawa house sometime in that first horrible month when everything arrived and nothing registered. It had sat in the box, unread, under the vehicle maintenance log for over a year. In it, Tessier wrote about the deployment, about the work. He wrote about the night in the Kandahar district, when things had gone badly wrong and her father had stayed back to cover the extraction point with Recon, the Belgian Malinois they had worked with, for the last 8 months of the deployment. He wrote about how Dennis had radioed in twice in 23 minutes and how Recon had never left his side. He wrote about what that kind of partnership meant, the way it couldn't be described from the outside, the way it lived only in the two of them, the man and the dog. And then he wrote, almost as an aside, that Recon had been retired from service the previous year, that he was in government holding outside of Trenton, that he was scheduled for public disposition. Fiona had read the word disposition and had to put the letter down. She picked up her cracked phone and searched for 40 minutes until she found the auction listing. Lot 14, Recon, Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, 4 years active service. Retired due to handler loss and subsequent placement difficulty. Placement difficulty. She read it 3 times. Then she transferred $1,400 from her savings account. Everything she had available, without touching the emergency account, her mother didn't know she knew about, and she drove to Trenton before the sun came up. Pickett opened Lot 12, and then Lot 13, and then he called Lot 14. 2 handlers brought Recon in from the back kennel area through a side door, and the room shifted. He was not what people expected when they pictured a military dog. He was not the clean, alert Belgian that appeared in the Force's promotional materials, the one with the bright eyes and the forward ears and the expression of focused readiness. Recon was 7 years old, and he carried those years in every visible part of his body. The dull patch along his left shoulder where the fur had not grown back right, the slightly uneven way he tracked his weight on the rear right leg when he stood still. He had been through things that had no paperwork equivalent. His eyes were amber and flat, and when he moved through the crowd, he did not look at any of them. He looked at the floor, he looked at the walls, he looked at the exit. He sat when the handlers signaled him, but it took a half-second longer than it should have, and one of the handlers, a younger man with a nervous jaw, kept his catchpole steady with the fixed attention of someone who was not entirely certain he wouldn't need it. Lot 14, Pickett said, reading from the sheet. Recon, Belgian Malinois, male, 7 years, 4 years active service with Seesaw. Retired 14 months ago. Basic obedience retained. Handler-specific bonding noted in file. Current temperament assessed as, he paused, guarded, requiring experienced placement. Someone in the 3rd row laughed quietly. The man from the Calgary firm leaned over to his colleague and said something Fiona couldn't hear. She watched Recon from the back of the room. He was scanning the space the same way he had always scanned spaces, she imagined. Methodical, continuous, looking for something that was not going to be there. She thought about what Tessier had written. He never left his side. She thought about 14 months of Recon waking up in a kennel that was not the right kennel, in a building full of strangers who smelled like nothing familiar, looking at a door that never opened the right way. She thought about herself doing the same thing in the house in Petawawa, getting up, making coffee, standing at the kitchen window at the exact time her father would have been up, would have been moving around the house with that particular early morning quiet of his, looking at a door that never opened. Pickett started the bidding at 400. The Calgary man bid 5. Someone near the front went to 650. The Calgary man went to 8. There was a pause. Then a man in a Henley shirt near the middle went to 900. Fiona raised her paddle. 1,000, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Pickett looked at her. The Calgary man looked at her. The man in the Henley shirt turned around in his chair and looked at her. Several other people turned around. From across the room, Recon turned his head. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at her, just for a second, the amber eyes moving across the distance between them, and then he looked away again, back at the floor, back at the wall. But he had looked. 1,000 from bidder 18, Pickett said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had seen stranger things. Do I hear 11? The Calgary man bid 1,100. Fiona bid 12. Someone in the back bid 13. She bid 14. And then she stopped, because 1,400 was everything she had brought, and she sat with her paddle in her lap and her heart doing something unpleasant in her chest while the Calgary man bid 15. Pickett looked toward her. She did not raise her paddle. 1,500, he said. Do we have 16? The room was quiet. Fiona was quiet. She was looking at Recon, who had gone back to scanning the walls with that same flat, methodical attention. She thought, he doesn't know. He can't know what's happening. He's just waiting for this to be over, same as always. He's been waiting for everything to be over for 14 months. Going once, Pickett said. The door behind the registration table opened. A woman came through, older, early 60s, in a forces jacket worn soft at the elbows. She moved through the back of the room quickly and stopped next to Pickett, and there was a brief exchange that Fiona couldn't hear. Pickett covered the microphone with his hand. "Excuse me," said the woman, loudly enough that it carried. Her name was Chief Warrant Officer Pauline Vickers, and she was the liaison officer responsible for the disposition of this particular lot, and she had driven from CFB Trenton that morning because something in the bidder intake form had caught her attention. "Could I ask bidder 18 to come forward for a moment?" Every head in the room turned. Fiona stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the front of the room with a composure that she would later not be able to fully account for, because inside her, everything was very loud and very disorganized. Vickers looked at her the way people in authority look at young women in rooms that were not designed for them, not unkindly, but with assessment. "You registered under Calloway," she said. "Yes. Is your father Dennis Calloway, Seor, Petawawa?" "He was," Fiona said. "He died 14 months ago." The room had gone quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Vickers looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Recon, who was sitting at the end of his catch poles with his amber eyes on the middle distance, waiting. Vickers had been in the forces for 31 years. She had processed the paperwork when Recon was pulled from active service. She had read the flag on his file that said handler deceased, placement attempts unsuccessful, elevated stress indicators in holding environment. She had filed the lot number. She had done her job. But she had also, 14 months ago, attended the funeral at the National Military Cemetery in Ottawa and stood 3 rows back while a girl in a dark green jacket stared at a flag-draped casket with the expression of someone who had not yet understood that something permanent had just happened. "How much did you bid?" Vickers said. 1,400, Fiona said. "That's everything I have. I know it's not." Vickers held up a hand. She turned to Pickett. She said 3 words very quietly. Pickett looked at her. He looked at the bidder sheet. He looked at the Calgary man who had set down his clipboard and was watching this with an unreadable expression. Pickett set the gavel down without striking it. "We're going to take a short recess," he said. They put Fiona in a side office that had a folding table and a coffee maker that had not been cleaned in a meaningful way. Vickers sat across from her and asked questions. Not interrogation questions, but the kind that a person asks when they are trying to understand the shape of a situation. How she had found out about the auction, what she knew about Recon, whether she had any experience with working dogs, with Malinois specifically, with animals that had come out of the kind of environment Recon had come out of. Fiona answered honestly. She did not have formal training. She had grown up with a lab mix until she was 12. She had read everything she could find about Malinois in the 3 weeks since she'd seen the listing, which was not nothing, but was also clearly not enough. "They're not easy dogs," Vickers said. "He's not an easy dog. He's been in holding for 1 year and 2 months. He was placed twice in that time. Both placements failed within 8 weeks. "I know," Fiona said. The second placement was with a retired handler professional, experienced with the breed. "I know," she said again. Vickers looked at her. "So what makes you think?" "Because he knew," Fiona said. It came out quieter than she intended. She stopped, started again. "When they brought him out, he looked at me, just for a second. I don't know what that means. I know that could mean nothing. But he looked, and I don't know how to explain this to you. I know it's not a reason. I know that's not how this works." She put her hands flat on the table. Outside the door, she could hear the low murmur of the auction resuming for the other lots. "I drove 4 hours in the dark," she said, "because my father spent 4 years of his life next to that dog, and that dog spent 14 months next to nobody. And I have—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I have an empty house and a yard, and I am not doing anything else with my life right now that matters as much as this does." The words sat in the room. Vickers was quiet for a long time. She was looking at the table, at the backs of her own hands, at some calculation that Fiona couldn't see. Then she stood up and opened the office door and said something to a handler in the hallway. 5 minutes later, they brought Recon into the office. He came in on a shorter lead, no catch poles, just a standard 6 foot, with the younger handler who had managed him during the lot presentation. Recon moved into the room and immediately did what he always did: scanned the perimeter, located the exits, assigned preliminary threat levels to the furniture. Then he stopped. He was 3 meters from Fiona, and he stopped. She did not move. She was watching him the way her father had always told her to watch things. Not staring, not flinching, just present. She kept her hands on the table, open, and she didn't speak. Recon's nose moved first. Slow, deliberate passes through the air between them. His ears shifted forward, then slightly back, then forward again. The handler kept the lead taut but did not correct. Fiona reached slowly into her canvas tote and took out a folded piece of fabric. It was one of her father's field shirts, olive drab, worn thin at the left shoulder, washed but not too many times. She had taken it from the box at the house 3 weeks ago when she first read Tessier's letter, and she had not put it back. She laid it on the table in front of her without reaching toward him. Recon's head came down. He crossed the 3 meters in 2 steps and put his nose into the fabric and went very, very still. Nobody said anything. He stayed there for a long time. Longer than a dog investigating a scent. Longer than an animal cataloging something new. He stayed there the way something stays when it has found what it has been looking for in the only way it knows how to look. His breathing slowed. The tension in his hindquarters, that constant coiled readiness that had not left him in 14 months of holding, eased. Vickers said very quietly, "Well." Recon lifted his head. He looked at Fiona. She looked back at him. And then slowly he moved around the end of the table and sat down beside her chair. Not in front of her, not across from her, but beside her, in the exact position he had been trained to take when the person he was paired with was sitting and he was keeping watch, and he put his head against her leg and he closed his eyes. Fiona did not cry in that room. She would cry later, in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the heater running and her hands gripping the steering wheel. She would cry in the way people cry when they are not sad exactly, but have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and have just, without warning, been able to set it down. But in the office, in that moment, she just put her hand on top of his head and held still. The paperwork took 2 hours. Vickers navigated it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been making bureaucratic systems behave themselves for 3 decades. There were forms about temperament disclosure and veterinary transfer and liability and handler acknowledgement. Fiona signed everything she was given. The Calgary man had left by the time she came out of the office, and the auction had wrapped, and most of the folding chairs had been stacked against the wall. Pickett was still at the podium, sorting his papers. He watched her come out with Recon on the standard lead, walking close to her left side, his attention moving forward and outward in that constant, quiet sweep. And Pickett did not say anything, but he nodded once with the expression of a man who has seen the conclusion of a story he was not expecting to be part of. The drive back to Petawawa was 3.5 hours. Recon spent the first 40 minutes in the back seat, with his chin on the center console, watching the road ahead over her shoulder. She didn't try to talk to him or manage him or do any of the things she had read about. She just drove, north on 33, through Napanee and past the flat grey farmland, coming back to life after a long winter, the fields still patchy with the last of the snow along the fence lines. She stopped in Deseronto for gas and left him in the car, with the windows cracked, and came back to find him in exactly the position she had left him, watching the door of the gas station until she came back through it. He ate when she got home. Not much, a third of what she put down, but he ate. He walked the perimeter of the yard twice, methodically, before coming back inside. He chose a spot near the front door and lay down facing the hallway, and he watched the house in the way he had been trained to watch things, and he did not pace, and he did not whine, and when she turned off the lights and went upstairs, he tracked the sound of her footsteps until they stopped. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, which had been very quiet for 14 months, and noticed that it was different now, not louder, but less empty. As though the silence had a shape to it that it hadn't had before. She thought about her father. She thought about Tessia's letter. He never left his side. She thought about how the things that mattered most were the ones that didn't make it into any official record. Not the commendations, not the service summary, not the form that used the word disposition, as though Recon were a piece of equipment to be reallocated. She thought about how much of her father lived in people and places she would never fully access. In letters that arrived too late, in the memories of men she had never met, and a dog who had spent 14 months looking for a door that opened the right way. She had not fixed that. She knew she hadn't fixed that. She was not Recon's handler, and she was not her father, and there were things about the dog's grief that she would not be equipped to reach. She understood that clearly. But she had driven 4 hours in the dark, and she had signed the forms, and she had brought him home. In the morning she came downstairs before 6 and found him still at his post by the front door, awake, ears forward, watching the hallway. When she came into the kitchen, he got up and followed her, close on her left side, and stood beside her while she filled the kettle, and the house filled slowly with the smell of coffee, and outside the Petawawa sky went from black to grey to the particular clear, pale blue of a northern Ontario morning in April. She put his bowl down. This time he ate everything in it. She stood at the kitchen window with her mug, and he stood beside her, and they looked out at the yard together. At the fence line, and the birch trees still bare at the edge of the property, and the last thin strip of snow along the north side of the house that the sun had not yet reached. He was not pacing. He was not scanning. He was standing beside her in the way he had learned to stand beside someone. Close and steady and facing outward, and for the first time in 14 months, the looking had somewhere to land.